In this presentation, we're going to look at the key thinkers in nationalism. And as with previous presentations, it's always useful to start off by reminding ourselves of the mark scheme. 24 marks for the ideologies essay, 5 levels of attainment up to a maximum of 24, but with a pretty severe cap unless you include at least 2 key thinkers in your essay. You only need to include 2, there's no requirement to include more. But if you don't include 2, you're going to get capped at level 2, which would give you a maximum of 9 out of 24. In earlier responses to the syllabus from students, there were examples of students who had made a point and then put the name of a key thinker in brackets after it. But from the latest examiner's reports, that's not going to be acceptable. You're going to have to elaborate on the argument the key thinkers were making and use those points to either support your judgment or to illustrate the judgment you disagree with. So you're going to need 2 or 3 sentences on the key thinker you're using, explaining how their arguments are relevant to the essay question and the judgment you're making, either for or against. So that's our assessment. For nationalism, your 5 key thinkers are Rousseau, von Herder, Mazzini, Maurras, and Marcus Garvey. In previous presentations, I have suggested that there were other thinkers related to the ideology you could use to help illustrate your arguments, but you had to be careful that they weren't named key thinkers, so you couldn't include them as one of the 2. For nationalism, I don't think there are really any other thinkers that you need to drop in. You can pretty much get away with the 5 named in the syllabus. And broadly, looking at the strands, Rousseau is broadly associated with liberal nationalism, self-determination. Von Herder, cultural nationalism, conservative nationalism, more mystical, irrational approach. Mazzini is an interesting one in the sense that he's associated with liberal nationalism, but he also had a strong undercurrent of mysticism and irrationality as well. Maurras is the expansionist nationalist. He's quite narrow, but he's a good example to use if you're talking about expansionist or aggressive, irrational nationalism. And Marcus Garvey is there as a representative of the anti or post-colonial nationalism, but maybe not quite as straightforward as the syllabus might suggest. So they are your 5 key thinkers. So moving on to the first one, which is Rousseau. And Rousseau's ideas, like other key thinkers in other ideologies, were partly formed as a result of the context in which he lived in. And he came from Switzerland, and in particular the city-state of Geneva, which he saw, or how he believed it was working, as a model for how governing our society could be run. And he also worked in the city-state of Venice, and he saw the corruption there as a model to be avoided. So before we specifically get on to Rousseau's contribution to nationalism, just a little bit of background about his thinking. Rousseau is a thinker that many different ideologies can draw on. In his most famous book, The Social Contract, he argued that human beings, we, are essentially good, but it's only society that has corrupted us. And the famous opening line of The Social Contract is, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." And you can see how anarchists would be attracted to this, because anarchists essentially believe that people do not need state and society and law and order. In fact, they corrupt us, and we're perfectly capable of managing our own affairs quite happily without the imposition of society and order, etc. Rousseau suggested that original humans were not social beings, as socialists might suggest, but we were entirely solitary. And to that extent, he agrees with Hobbes's account of the state of nature. But in contrast to Hobbes's extremely pessimistic view that human life in state of nature must have been poor, nasty, brutish, and short, Rousseau claimed that original humans, we, although we were admittedly solitary, we were healthy, happy, we were good, and we were free. He argued that human vices date from the time when societies were formed. And in particular, he blamed the introduction of property which marked a step towards inequality, and then law and government were a means of protecting property. And you can see Rousseau's foreshadowing of Marx, or Marx drawing on Rousseau, and Marx's explanation as to how we escaped from tribal communism into slave society with the introduction of agriculture and surplus and profit, etc. So Marx drew on some of Rousseau's thinking there for his explanations. Civil society, for Rousseau, came into being for two reasons. One was to provide peace and security for everyone. Again, a very pretty standard Lockean, Hobbesian argument. But secondly, also to ensure the right of property for anyone lucky enough to have property. So while civil society was for the advantage of everyone, it was mostly for the advantage of the rich, since it transformed their actual or de facto ownership into rightful legal ownership and kept the poor dispossessed. So for Rousseau, society as it was, the social contract as it was a bit of a fraud, since the poor got so much less out of it than the rich, because it imposed inequality and baked it into the system. Now, Rousseau argued that in a state of nature, before this, we were all free, but he also accepted that it just wasn't practical for us to return to a state of nature. So how can we change society to make us free once more? So Rousseau's response to this was he believed society should be governed by what he called the general will, or in the French phrase, the volonté générale. He believed that we could achieve freedom as citizens, where we give up some rights and become subjects of a state in return for rights of citizens. So this was Rousseau's idea of a renegotiated social contract, if you like. In the social contract, Rousseau, very much Lockean, argued against the idea that monarchs were somehow divinely empowered to rule and to legislate. Rousseau asserted that only the people who are sovereign have that all-powerful right. And according to him, all political power must reside with the people, exercising this general will. There was to be no separation of powers, as Montesquieu proposed and later liberal thinkers, framers of the Constitution, the American Constitution, came up with. It was the people meeting together who would deliberate individually on laws and then by a majority vote find the general will. Again, he's using what he thought was how Geneva was operating as his model. So clearly Rousseau's concept of democracy was what we would now call direct democracy, or the Athenian model. He did accept that some majority decisions would go against minorities, but in his idea of the general will, the communal good would be the aggregate or the average of the desires of citizens. And here again, he's kind of foreshadowing Bentham's utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. So Rousseau's democracy was small-scale democracies, a bit like his city-state in Geneva, a direct democracy in which everyone voted to express their views, but the general will would prevail. As a kind of side, in his democracy, he felt that anyone who disobeyed the general will should be forced to be free. And the 20th century philosopher Hannah Arendt pointed the finger at Rousseau as kind of laying the basis for totalitarian regimes, where citizens who disagreed with the state were somehow forced to be free. But come back to Rousseau and nationalism. Now, Rousseau didn't specifically address the question of the nation, or he didn't have any discussion of the phenomenon of nationalism, but his stress on popular sovereignty, expressed in this idea of the general will, was the seedbed from which later nationalist doctrine sprang. Rousseau's view of this idea of the general will, you can see it in the first three words of the American Constitution: we the people. During the French Revolution, Rousseau's beliefs were reflected in the assertion of the revolutionaries that the French people were citizens possessed of inalienable rights and duties, and were no longer subjects of the crown. The people possessed sovereign power. Sovereign power for the French revolutionaries rested with the French nation. And the revolutionaries, when the National Assembly was formed and they issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man, that expressly stated that the law is an expression of the general will. So the form of nationalism that emerged from the French Revolution was therefore based on the idea of a people or a nation governing itself. The nation was a natural community and a natural political community. So looking at the slide then, Rousseau's link to core nationalist ideas were about nations, nation states and self-determinations. The nation, through the people, was a natural community and a natural political community through which it would govern itself. Sovereignty rested with the people. So linking Rousseau to other debates within nationalism is clearly a rational form of nationalism. It's later linked to liberal nationalism and self-determination. The nation could be a civic nation. It was a progressive form of nationalism, and it could be seen as inclusive. And a couple of quotes from Rousseau that might be useful in an essay, but there's no requirement to quote directly from any of the thinkers. Rousseau, the law is the expression of the general will. All citizens have the right to contribute personally or through the representative to its formation. It must be the same for all, whether it protects or punishes. So this was Rousseau's central argument, as you will study in writing about nationalism, that the nation is a natural political community, the people are sovereign and they're ruled by the general will, and by implication not by sovereigns or emperors or czars or kaisers. And secondly, the general will tends always to the preservation and welfare of the whole. Obedience to the general will enhances liberty. So the role of the state and its leaders is to simply implement the general will. So that's the first key thinker, Rousseau. So next we move on to von Herder. For the French revolutionaries, following on from Rousseau, the state was the expression of a single will of a united sovereign people. Herder rejected this, what we would call rationalist Enlightenment approach. He opposed the Enlightenment view that the political community is a construct made up of all those who are subject to sovereign power based on this idea of a social contract. For Herder, this social contract was an artificial construct. It was simply a false notion dreamt up by idealistic dreamers. As we saw with conservatism, and a trend we saw throughout conservatism, he and other conservatives are very strongly opposed to what you would call abstract notions. And Herder was at the forefront of what was called the Romantic counter-Enlightenment. They rejected concentration on universal laws and truths, and instead human affairs and natures could only be understood through studying traditional practices and customs and forms of behaviour, history, literature, the arts, and for Herder, especially language. Where someone like Marx saw classes as the basic units of history or historical actors, for Herder, the basic units of history were national cultures. For Herder, communities and cultures were particular and unique, and human nature varied according to cultural and physical environments. Language was central to this, and a language embodied the uniqueness of a culture expressing a whole way of life, the collective experience of a nation. And he placed particular importance on the capacity of language, which was far more important, according to Herder, than political institutions, because it helped foster a people's historical identity and generate a sense of unity. He also claimed that the only effective and legitimate governments were ones that developed naturally, or what conservatives would say developed organically among particular nations, and that reflected in their differences the cultures of the people they governed. For Herder, the cultural nation, not a civic nation, is the true basis of a political community, an organic construct, very mystical, very much anti-Enlightenment, anti-social contract theory. In echoes of sort of Burke's little platoons and indeed collectivist anarchism, Herder thought communities could be self-governing, with power diffused or spread through mutually interdependent communities. Whereas Herder is very much on the conservative spectrum in political thought. Ironically, his ultimate endpoint for society was like a pluralist, anarchist society with these little communities self-governing, but also interdependent. Linking the argument that conservative nationalism is not inherently aggressive or expansionist, for Herder, relations between nations allowed an understanding of other nationalities, even if they were inclusive, and encouraged people to understand what was distinctive about their own culture. Herder rejected imperialism, which he saw as imposing on a different group of people a culture which was not their own. So going back to his contribution to your essays in nationalism, clearly he has a distinctive view about nations and nation state. For Herder, nations are based around cultural factors, geography, history, the arts, and particularly language. It's a form of cultural nationalism rather than civic nationalism. It's a mystical, organic concept. He's very much a conservative nationalist. Is it regressive or backward? I suppose it's static more than regressive, but it can be regressive. It's quite exclusive. Not everybody can join it because you have to belong to this cultural nation, and the nation is a cultural concept. Some of the quotes: each nationality contains its centre of happiness within itself. Every nation bears in itself the standard of its perfection, totally independent of all comparison with that of all others. So Herder's argument is very much an ethno-cultural argument, that each nation is unique and bound together by culture, language, history, myths, but also language as well. Providence has wonderfully separated nationalities not only by woods and mountains, seas and deserts, rivers and climates, but more particularly by languages, inclinations, and characters. So this was Herder's list of common factors which comprise a nation. Nothing is more manifestly contrary to the purpose of political government than the unnatural enlargement of states, the mixing of various races and nationalities under one sceptre. So here Herder was arguing against colonialism and empire building because he saw that as causing instability. Because don't forget, the main focus on traditional conservatism is order and cohesion, and trying to enlarge your state by incorporating other nations caused instability. And also, you can use that point if you're doing an essay about whether nationalism is inherently aggressive and expansionist. Conservative nationalism really isn't, according to Herder. It's much more inclusive. It's actually quite peaceful. It recognizes other nations have a right to exist, but they are very, very inclusive, and the emphasis on inclusive instability. Conservative nationalism can tip into expansionist aggressivism, as we'll see during the age of empires and the scramble for Africa. But at its core, it's not inherently expansionist and aggressive. And key one for Herder, there is only one class in the state, the Volk, the people. And this was Herder's mythical concept of the people, the Volk, which drew on the conservative idea of the organic society. And Herder's claimed that each nation possessed a Volksgeist, a unique spirit. Again, you can see how it's very mystical and what we would call irrational. And again, as long as we keep our native language and our tongue, we will penetrate so much more deeply the distinctiveness of each language. And again, Herder's cultural nationalism in particular stresses the importance of language to a culture or a nation. Okay, so next key thinker then is Mazzini. And Mazzini, very much associated with liberal nationalism, but he was also inspired by what we call a distinctively liberal form of nation or nationalism. And he championed two principles which he believed were universally applicable to any people or nation. He said every nation a state and only one state for the entire nation. And Mazzini's nationalism had a profound influence across Europe in strengthening the idea that freedom entails the creation of one's own nation state. And particularly he was railing against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who occupied large parts of northern Italy. So again, he's arguing against the rule by emperors, kaisers, czars, or whatever. To this end, he found a secret revolutionary society in 1832 called Young Italy, and he championed the movement for Italian unity, uniting all those separate little bits of Italy, city-states and regions, and that was known as the Risorgimento, excuse my pronunciation, and that was designed to try and bring these separate entities and that leg of Italy together as a single nation and throw out foreign rule. He continued his love of freedom. He joined another secret society called the Carbonari, pledged to overthrow other types of rule in Italy. So Mazzini believed that nationalism meant the liberation of people from foreign rule, and that when people were liberated and assumed control of their own affairs, they would naturally adopt democratic institutions. And 50 years after Mazzini, the other great liberal nationalist, President Woodrow Wilson, he again follows in Mazzini's footsteps in advocating national self-determination as a way to bring about peace and democracy in global politics. Mazzini's nationalism, although it's linked to liberal nationalism, is very much a romantic kind of approach. It's got more perhaps in common with some elements of conservatism. I mean, he distrusted intellectualism and rationalism and abstract thinking like conservatives do, arguing that thought must always be harnessed to action and vice versa. And he expressed this in the concept of thought and action. He was also very religious. He argued that God had created separate countries, dividing humanity into different branches, but branches that would and could cooperate peacefully. Again, it foreshadows what we would call liberal internationalism. As with many other nationalist figures, he viewed the individualism of liberalism as contrary to the goal of creating a coherent national identity. For him, patriotism, the love of one's country, this kind of subjective factor, was both a duty, and he said, the home wherein God has placed us among brothers and sisters linked to us by the family ties of common religion, history and language. So again, linked to liberal nationalism, but with strong elements of romantic and irrational thought as well. And for Mazzini, the nationalist cause had to take precedence over all other causes, and he regarded patriotism, the love of your country, your fatherland, as a divine mission. So looking back to Mazzini and core nationalist ideas, well, clearly it's about self-determination, and that phrase, every nation a state and only one state for the entire nation, again linking to Rousseau, the state, a nation is a natural community and it's a natural political community, and it's a progressive form of nationalism in the sense that it sees self-rule and self-determination as the only legitimate way for people to rule. Is it peaceful? Well, certainly his initial methods to overthrow rule wasn't peaceful. He was a rebel and he forms violent secret societies. But once the nation state has been formed, it will be peaceful and could coexist peacefully with other nations. So again, he displays this kind of paradoxical nature of nationalism. It can be both peaceful and violent. It's rational in the sense that people should govern themselves as a single nation, but it's also got this mystical quality of the fatherland and patriotism, and is very mystical as well and very religious. So Mazzini is a bit of a contradiction in some aspects. So some of the quotes, every nation is destined by the law of God and humanity to form a free and equal community of brothers. So again, clearly Mazzini's support for self-determination. God has given you your country as a cradle and humanity as a mother. You cannot rightly love your brethren of the cradle if you love not the common mother. So his devotion to nationalism, if you like, the rational, progressive view, was very heavily influenced by his Catholicism, and his motto was Dio e Popolo, God and people. Without country, you have neither name, token, voice, nor rights, no admission as brothers into the fellowship of peoples. So patriotism or love of country was a duty. A country is not a mere territory. The particular territory is on its foundation. The country is the idea which rises upon the foundation. It is the sentiment of love, the sense of fellowship which binds together all sons of that territory. So again, this kind of very anti-rational, mystical idea of the nation. No nation deserves freedom as long retainers does not win it for itself. Revolutions must be made by the people and for the people. So again, although once the nation has been formed, it can reside peacefully with other nations, it can be quite violent in its early stages. And there's a kind of echo of the anti-colonialist Frantz Fanon's need for violence as a kind of form of catharsis to help people free themselves from foreign rule. So that was Mazzini. Next thinker is Charles Maurras. And Maurras is quite a narrow thinker, very much associated with expansionist nationalism. So Maurras promotes the notion of a national community based on blood and soil, which later German Nazis would use, Blut and Bloden. The French revolutionaries, their nation was based on, liberty, equality, and fraternity. But for Maurras and expansionist nationalism, it's much more mystical, it's much more inclusive. Again, this idea of blood and soil, a racially defined national body through blood united with a common area in soil. And Maurras' style of nationalism is a rejection of kind of liberal democratic principles, which he believed were contrary to natural inequality in society and the world. For him, the whole Enlightenment project had led to this pernicious individualism where individuals placed a higher value upon themselves rather than, as he thought, should be on the nation as a whole. Despite what its supporters claimed, democracy and liberalism, according to Maurras, had a negative impact on both the individual and wider society. After the destruction and chaos of the French Revolution, for Maurras, society should get back to for him, it was a hereditary monarchy underpinned by Catholicism. So again, he's a kind of very anti-Enlightenment figure, offers a counter-argument to the ideas put forward by Rousseau. His main idea was something called integral nationalism. It emphasizes the organic unity of the nation, which fuses a kind of illiberal rejection of individualism and democracy and a stress on hierarchy and traditional institutions. In this case, for him, that was the French monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church. And he had this mystical belief in goddess France as the highest form of civilization. And he was if you like, an international Darwinist. And the mission of the nation was intrinsically linked to expansion and war, grounded in the belief that some nations are destined for conquest and glory, and others are weak and subordinate and don't deserve freedom. So Maurras' contribution to core nationalist ideas is a very mystical view of the nations. Nations are very much based on a much stronger than an ethno-cultural view, but on a racialist view. So it's an extreme form of ethno-cultural nationalism, much further than someone like Herder. It's clearly quite violent in that it is expansionist and aggressive. It believes that there's a hierarchy of nations, and those further down the hierarchy do not have a right to exist. It's irrational. It's this kind of mystical view of the power of the nation. It's exclusive, in that you cannot join this nation. Is it progressive or regressive? Again, this is one of the paradoxes. It's quite regressive in that often integral nationalism seeks to sort of recapture past glories. For Maurras, it was the glory of the French monarchy and the Catholic Church. For Mussolini, it was the glory of the Roman Empire. But in a perverse way, it was also progressive because it saw itself as inflicting, if you want to use that word, its superior values on inferior nations. So it's progressive, but in a, you'd have to use that word, perverse way. So Maurras quotes, "For monarchy to work, one man must be wise. for democracy to work, a majority of the people must be wise, which is more likely. So Maurras was a conservative authoritarian. He believed that absolute monarchy was the best form of government. Democracy was impractical and irrational. A true nationalist places his country above everything. So with integral nationalism, the individual counts for nothing. You can see the kind of seedbed of Hitler's fascism and Nazism there. The individual only exists to serve the greater good of the nation or the state, the Volk. One no more chooses one country, the lands of one's father, than one chooses father and mother. So this kind of mystical, anti-rational and exclusive approach to nationalism. And nationalism defends the nation against the stranger from within. And Maurras' exclusivity clearly tips into racialism, racism, often directed against his internal enemies were Protestants, Jews, and immigrants. So Maurras very much expansionist, aggressive nationalist. And the last key thinker then is Marcus Garvey. And Garvey is there as a representative of anti and post-colonialism. And another interesting figure, he was born in Jamaica, after which he travelled a bit Central America. He lived in London for a while, returned to Jamaica, and then went to live in America, where he founds the Universal Negro Improvement and Conservation Association. And his main idea was to try and build an Africa for black people, an Africa continent-wide, pan-nationalism that was for black people. He clearly foreshadows much later movements in the 50s and 60s and up to the present day on establishing black pride. And his vision was of an Africa as a homeland, that he saw all black people as having a common heritage. So his idea of Africa for the Africans was associated with what's called Pan-Africanism. And he inspired later figures such as Nkrumah, the first Prime Minister of Ghana. So Pan-Africanism is a form of, you can say it's expansionist nationalism. It promotes a sense of shared historical fate for Africans everywhere, whether it's in America or the West Indies. And Garvey encouraged African people around the world to be proud of their race and see beauty in their own kind. His central belief was that African people in every part of the world were one people, and they would never progress if they did not put aside their cultural and ethnic differences. And his ultimate dream was for the creation of a United States of Africa. And he even set up a company called the Black Star Liner to try and help black people to return to Africa, although ironically he himself never actually visited Africa. So again, he sets this precedent for subsequent black nationalist and Pan-African thought. So Garvey, you can see, is about nations, and he's particularly about self-determination. It is rational in some sense, but it's also a kind of form of cultural nationalism and racialism as well. I mean, Garvey was a supporter of racial separatism. He believed, in the strict sense of racialism, that races were different. He wasn't a racist, he didn't believe that the black race was superior to other races. And he didn't wish to create a hostile atmosphere with white people, but he certainly admired, the Ku Klux Klan, for example, as Malcolm X later on met with the Ku Klux Klan. They were both separatists. Obviously, the Ku Klux Klan very differently in terms of violently, but they argued for a separate white nation, and Garvey and his supporters argued for a separate black nation. But the purpose for Garvey's separatism was to empower black people and enable them to find an identity, not the out-and-out racism of people like the Ku Klux Klan. So Garvey argued that instead of looking to be assimilated into an American nation or wherever they lived, black nationalists should maintain and promote their own separate identity as people of black ancestry. With such slogans as Black Power and Black is Beautiful, they sought to inculcate a sense of pride among blacks, very much this kind of post-colonialism as well. And he thought the blacks would only be respected when they're economically strong, and he argued for independent black businesses and a black economy within the framework of capitalism. So Garvey's contribution to nationalism It's an exclusive form of nationalism. It's not inclusive because it's very much based around racialism, if you like, the neutral view of racialism, that the world is divided into separate races. Again, it's got this paradox in that anti-colonial nationalism can be violent, especially to overthrow colonial oppression. But once nationhood has been achieved, it's peaceful. It doesn't seek to expand its borders further, and it seeks peace and cooperation with other ones. It's both progressive in the sense that it seeks self-determination, but it can also be regressive, and it seeks to try and recover what it felt were previous past glories, um, or past stance of previous nations. And again, it very much contributes to the idea of nations. For Garvey, black people, black Africans were a distinct nation, and they were a distinct, viable political community as well. So some of Garvey's quotes: "A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without its roots." So again, this is very much the anti-colonial call for native peoples to reclaim their true or authentic identity, to throw off the psychological and physical shackles of imperialism and colonialism, and reclaim or recapture their true, authentic selves. I mean, there's a kind of slight echo of Rousseau's, reclaiming your original freedom, going back to a kind of state of nature, and that the colonial and imperial society had imposed an inequality on you, and you need to achieve this freedom in order to find your true self. Africa, for the Africans at home and abroad, again, is called for Pan-Africanism. We are going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, for through others may free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind. And again, Garvey's highlighting the psychological roots of oppression, that even when the physical manifestations of oppression were removed, somehow black people, minorities, felt themselves still inferior. And again, we listened to in the class, Bob Marley uses it in his version of Redemption Song: "Free yourself from mental slavery. Take the kinks out of your mind instead of your hair." Again, linked to colonial people adopting, or being forced to, or feeling they have to adopt, an inauthentic identity. Again, this was a theme picked up by Malcolm X in the 60s. And the black skin is not a badge of shame, but a glorious symbol of national greatness. And again, he's foreshadowing the later movements in the 60s and 70s of black power, black is beautiful, and reclaiming a proud heritage. So that was Marcus Garvey. Finish off with other supporters or views of nationalism. J.S. Mill, who we come across obviously in liberalism. He felt that a necessary condition of free institutions is that the boundaries of governments should coincide with the boundaries of those nationalities. Again, expressing this liberal view, that the nation is a natural community, and it's also a natural political community. Benedict Anderson, a much more modern thinker, he described nations as an imagined political community. It's imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. And Anderson argued that nations are really just modern developments, and they are kept in place and fostered by, media, common legal, and education systems. Some of the critics of nationalism, modern day critics, Simon Winder, nice quote. I mean, he was looking at the Balkans and the terrible wars that happened when Yugoslavia broke up. He says nationalism always starts off with folk dancing, but ends up with barbed wire. Because the criticism is that nationalism highlights what divides people, and you end up having this division, which often ends up as violent and can lead to ethnic cleansing and even genocide. Eric Hobsbawm, Marx's critique of nationalism: the history of nationalism is the history of war, genocide, and oppression. Fairly straightforward view there. Marx, of course, is internationalist. It's about class, solidarity across countries, and nationalism, again, highlights what divides people. Karl Deutsch: a nation is a group of people united by a mistaken view of their past and a hatred of their neighbours. And this criticism that myths and nationalism and national identity, again, highlights what divides people, and that's the danger leading to violence and oppression. And Albert Einstein, nationalism is an infantile disease. It is the measles of the mind. And Einstein again saw nationalism as irrational, regardless of what form, and a virus inflicting mankind. So some of the quotes you could possibly use if you're talking about nationalism as inherently expansionist and aggressive or peaceful or violent. So come back to where we came in then. Our key thinkers, Rousseau, von Herder, Mazzini, Maurras, Garvey, and you need to reference at least two of these gentlemen, and they're all gentlemen, to allow yourself the ability to attain level 5 in the mark scheme.